Hey guys, Dimension Master Studios here. How y'all doing? So, when it comes to Dragons Rising, one of the big things that fans have been talking about is the idea of older characters returning. This is something that a lot of people have been discussing about for a long time when it comes to Dragons Rising, mainly because at this point we aren't really sure which old characters are gonna show up during Dragons Rising. However, one interesting thing that happened when it came to the returning characters for Dragons Rising was earlier on this year with the release of the Elemental Max miniseries, where we saw the return of the mechanic. And as a result of this, one big thing that a lot of fans began to talk about was the idea of older villains returning and who might show up at some point. So in today's video, I want to take a look at the various major antagonists that we've gotten over the years when it comes to the franchise and discuss the possibility of them returning. Now, before I get into this video, one thing that I do have to say, this video will contain spoilers for part 2 of Season 2 of Dragons Rising, so if you haven't seen it yet, please keep in mind that this video will contain spoilers. But with all that out of the way, let's get into this whole thing. Now, when it comes to the villains that I'm going to be taking a look at, I've divvied them up into 4 categories. The first category being the villains who will return in Dragons Rising, the second category being the villains who are likely to return in Dragons Rising, the third category being the villains who could return in Dragons Rising, and finally the fourth category being the villains who will not return in Dragons Rising. Now, please keep in mind this is all purely speculation on my part, and I'm going off of stuff that we've seen so far when it comes to Dragons Rising, as well as stuff when it comes to Ninjago in general when it comes to the possibility of these villains returning. So please keep that in mind, and if you disagree with me on any of the villains and whether or not they have the possibility of returning or how likely it is, that is perfectly fine. But with all that being said, let's now get into discussing the villains and the possibility of them returning. So for starters, we have the villains who will be returning in Dragons Rising. And in my opinion, out of every single villain that we've gotten over the years when it comes to Ninjago, there is only one older villain who I think we can say will be returning in Dragons Rising, with that villain pretty obviously being Garmadon. I feel like if there's any major antagonist who will be showing up in Dragons Rising at some point, it's going to be Garmadon. Given that Garmadon is a really important character when it comes to Ninjago, with him playing a big role in various seasons, and him undergoing a lot of change and development over time, especially during the Oni trilogy, I think it's safe to say that when it comes to Garmadon, he's gonna be showing up again at some point during the events of Dragons Rising. Especially given that following the events of Crystallize, when it comes to the whereabouts of Garmadon specifically, it's a bit unclear, especially considering what we saw at the end of Crystallized, with Garmadon ending up on good terms with the rest of the ninja team. It's a bit unclear where he was during the events of the merge. Plus, not to mention, there's already been a few things that we've seen so far when it comes to Dragons Rising that tie in Garmadon in some way or another. For starters, there were the early set leaks for the Dragonstone Temple set, where a Garmadon minifigure was going to be included in that set. Now, granted, obviously this didn't happen, and Garmadon wasn't even in Season 2 of Dragons Rising, but still, I feel like the idea of a minifigure for Garmadon being included is still a big deal, and it doesn't discount the possibility that Garmadon could show up again at some point. Plus, not to mention, there's also the recently released Shatterspin comic, which features Garmadon as its main protagonist, and we know that the Shatterspin comic does tie directly into Dragons Rising, meaning it's possible that when it comes to Dragons Rising, we could see Garmadon return, given that he has experience going up against foes with Shatterspin, and given the fact that the ninja are going up against the Forbidden Five, who use Shatterspin, it would make sense to bring in Garmadon, who again has experience fighting against this stuff. Either way, though, when it comes to Garmadon, given how big of a deal he is when it comes to the Ninjago franchise, with how important of a character he is, as well as how popular of a character he is, with many fans considering Garmadon to be one of, if not the best Ninjago characters of all time, I feel like it's safe to say that out of every single villain that I'm going to be talking about in this video, Garmadon is the only villain who will be showing up in Dragons Rising at some point. So moving on from this, now we have the villains whose return is likely to happen during Dragons Rising. And in my opinion, there are 5 villains who are likely to return in Dragons Rising at some point or another, with those villains being Klaus, Vex, the Ice Emperor, Notakon, and Moro. I feel like all these villains have a likely chance to return during Dragon's Rising at some point or another. Let's start off with Klaus and Vex, because the big reason why I feel like these two are likely to return is because of the exact same reason for the two of them being stuck inside of other realms. This is something that I've talked about a few times on my channel, but I feel like when it comes to Dragon's Rising, we're going to inevitably see the ninja go to every single realm at some point during Dragon's Rising. And I feel like as a result of this, we could potentially see these older characters show up at some point. When it comes to Klaus, we know thanks to the Dark Island trilogy that Klaus is currently stuck in the underworld, and that's where he's been for a very long time. Meanwhile, at the end of Season 11, Vex ended up getting banished, meaning he's still out there somewhere in the Neverrealm. Meaning that when it comes to both these characters, they're still out there somewhere in the realms that they're trapped in. Meaning that when the ninja inevitably go to the underworld and the Neverrealm respectively, I feel like we do have a decent chance of seeing these characters return at some point, given that again, they're still out there somewhere, meaning that we could potentially get a chance to see them again at some point. Moving on from this, we then have the Ice Emperor, and when it comes to the Ice Emperor, while I don't think we're going to physically see him make a return at some point, given the fact that the Ice Emperor was defeated at the end of Season 11 and Zane was able to overcome his trauma in the Quest for the Lost Power story, I still feel like we could see the Ice Emperor return when the ninja do eventually go back to the Neverrealm. This is something that I've talked about a few times, but an interesting idea that I have for a potential Zane story is one that revolves around Zane trying to seek forgiveness from the people of the Neverrealm for the stuff that he did as the Ice Emperor. While Zane was able to forgive himself for the terrible stuff that he did as the Ice Emperor, it's entirely possible that the people of the Neverrealm either haven't or they didn't forgive Zane for the stuff that he did as the Ice Emperor. So something that we could see is Zane trying to seek forgiveness from the people of the Neverrealm, and we could potentially see some flashbacks that feature the Ice Emperor as a result of it. Either way, though, when the ninja do inevitably go back to the Neverrealm at some point, I feel like at the very least the Ice Emperor is going to be mentioned even if he doesn't physically show up. After this, we have Nanakon, and the main reason why I feel like Nanakon's return is something that's likely is because of the recreation of Ninjago. This is something that was set up during Season 1 of Dragon's Rising with the character Ericor, who we saw holding on to a piece of Ninjago that slowly got bigger over time as a result of Ericor gaining more hope. And the season did set up the idea that Ninjago could theoretically be recreated at some point. And given that the destruction of Ninjago was the entire reason why Nanakon decided to fight against the ninja in the first place during Season 6, I feel like bringing him back in some way and tying it to the recreation of Ninjago is something that would make a lot of sense. Additionally, though, if Nanakon were to return, this could actually answer the question of what exactly happened to Nanakon after Skybound. We know that Nanakon ended up reversing time as a result of Jay's final wish, but it's a bit unclear what happened to Nanakon specifically. Does he remember the events of Skybound? Does he still have a vendetta against the ninja? And what exactly happened to him? We know that Clutch Powers got a hold of the Teapot of Tyran during Season 12, but it's a bit unclear what exactly happened to Nanakon. So if the show were to bring him back, I feel like it would make a lot of sense and we could get a proper conclusion to his story. That being said, though, we are probably going to have to wait until Jay becomes a member of the ninja team again in order to actually get Nanakon to return, given that Nanakon is a Jay antagonist. But either way, I feel like Nanakon's return is something that's likely. And finally, there's Moro, and when it comes to Moro, the main reason why I feel like we could see Moro return is because the writers of Ninjago have actually discussed the possibility of Moro returning, saying that because of the merge, anything is possible. And I feel like if the writers are talking about the possibility of Moro returning, then this is something that we could potentially see at some point. Additionally, we don't really know how the Departed Realm works as a result of the merge, but let's face it, if there's any dead villains who are gonna show up in Dragon's Rising when the ninja do go to the Departed Realm, it's going to be Moro, given how big of a deal he is when it comes to Ninjago, and once again, him being a pretty popular character. Plus, also, when it comes to Moro, something that a lot of fans have noticed is that when it comes to the story that Eren is going through during Season 2 of Dragon's Rising, it's pretty similar to what happened with Moro during Season 5, so we could potentially see Moro return, and he could potentially be some kind of mentor figure for Eren, with him potentially turning Eren back to the side of good. I feel like that is a possibility, but we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. Either way, though, when it comes to Mora's return, I feel like this is, once again, something that is likely and could happen during Dragon's Rising. Moving on from this, now we have the villains who could return in Dragon's Rising. Meaning, these are going to be the villains who I think have the chance of returning, but their chances aren't as high as some of the villains that I've talked about earlier, but they're not as low as the villains that I will be talking about. And in my opinion, there are 11 villains who could return during Dragon's Rising, with those villains including the remaining members of the Council of the Crystal King, meaning Pythor, Asphyra, the Skull Sorcerer, and Mr. F, the Overlord himself, Acronix and Crux, Iron Baron, the Omega, Unagami, and Chief Momatus. All these villains, I feel, do have a chance of returning at some point during Dragon's Rising. Starting off with the remaining members of the Council of the Crystal King, the main reason why I think these characters could return is because of the mechanic and him showing up in Dragon's Rising. We know, thanks to Tommy Andreasen, that the Council of the Crystal King was arrested at the end of Crystallized, even though the show never hints at this once. Either way, though, this did end up happening, and they ended up getting locked up in Cryptarium Prison. And if the mechanic was able to escape from Cryptarium Prison, then who's to say this didn't happen with the other villains? It's entirely possible that maybe they were in fact able to escape. So we could potentially see these other villains return at some point, although I don't think it's very likely, with one exception, with that obviously being Pythor. Given that Pythor is without question the most popular out of the council members, and given that Pythor is a pretty big deal when it comes to Ninjago, I do feel like his return is more likely in comparison to the other members. Additionally, a big reason why a lot of people really wanted to see Pythor return in the first place is so that way Crystallized could give him a proper conclusion to his story, and Crystallized never did that, and given that Dragon's Rising has been doing, in my opinion, a pretty good job actually at fixing a lot of the criticisms that people had of Crystallized, maybe something that we could see is Pythor potentially returning, so that way we could get a proper conclusion to his story. I think that's a possibility. Oh, and as for Mr. F dying at the end of Crystallize, according to Tommy Andreasen, Mr. F's death is up to interpretation, meaning it's possible that he survived, or maybe he died. It's a bit unclear, and it's up to viewer interpretation as to what exactly happened with him. So, moving on from the council members, now we have the Overlord himself. And when it comes to the Overlord, the big reason why I think he could be returning is because of Crystallized establishing that the Overlord is going to keep on returning no matter what. During the events of Crystallized, we learned that when it comes to the Overlord, no matter what happens to him, he's just going to keep on coming back over and over and over again, no matter what the ninja do, as a result of people doing bad things, no matter how big or small they are. Meaning that when it comes to the Overlord, there's literally an in-universe reason given as to why he has the ability to return. Meaning that when it comes to Dragon's Rising, I feel like it's possible that we could see him show up at some point. Plus, I feel like if the Overlord were to return, I think this would be a good thing, because this could actually give the ninja the opportunity to destroy the Overlord once and for all, and break the cycle of them and the Overlord having to constantly fight against one another over and over again. I think that is a possibility, but once again, we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. After this, we have the Time Twins, and when it comes to the Time Twins, the idea of them returning is something that fans have been discussing for years at this point. It's something that a lot of people really want to see happen, and when it comes to the Time Twins returning, I feel like this is something that we could potentially see when it comes to Dragon's Rising, given that, just like Moro, the writers have discussed the idea of the Time Twins potentially returning at some point, or at the very least, having the elemental power of time potentially return at some point, which would definitely be a big deal given how powerful of an element time is, meaning it's possible that we could see it return at some point. Plus, when it comes to the Time Twins, I feel like if the element of time were to return, it would make sense for the Time Twins to return at some point. Plus, if the Time Twins were to return, we could also get a more proper conclusion to their story, because although the short Golden Hour did show us Acronix and Crux getting stuck in the time stream as a result of Wu messing with Iron Doom, I wouldn't really call that a proper conclusion for Acronix and Crux, so if they were to return, again, we could get a proper conclusion for the two of them. Plus, also, fans have theorized that when it comes to a Kronks and Crux, they may have had something to do with the merge starting in the first place, which could be a possibility, but either way, we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. But overall, I feel like when it comes to a Kronks and Crux, these two could end up returning at some point. So moving on from this, now we have Iron Baron, and you're probably thinking, wait, didn't Iron Baron die towards the end of Season 9 when he got turned into a statue by Firstborn? And that is actually a common misconception when it comes to the franchise, and that's something that I even believed for a long time. But no, Iron Baron didn't actually die, but instead Iron Baron was just turned into a statue, and apparently he's still alive. So when it comes to Iron Baron, this means that technically he is still out there, although I don't think his chances of returning are as likely in comparison to Vex and Klaus, even though he is from another realm. And like I said, I feel like inevitably the ninja are going to go to every single realm. And the big reason why I feel like Iron Baron's return isn't as likely is mainly because of the fact of him getting turned into a statue, and it's a bit unclear whether or not he was able to get out of that or if he's still there. Either way, though, when it comes to Iron Baron's return, I feel like this is something that could happen, but again, I don't think it's as likely in comparison to some of these other villains. After this, we have the Omega, and pretty similar to Iron Baron, it is a misconception that the Omega ended up dying at the end of Season 10, because when it comes to the Omega and the rest of the Oni, it's actually unclear as to what exactly happened with them at the end of Season 10. We know that they were defeated by the power of the Tornado of Creation, but it's unclear whether or not they died or if they disappeared. We don't really know what happened, but if the Omega is still out there, I feel like it's possible that we could see him return at some point, given Dragons Rising's major emphasis on dragons, and we know that when it comes to the Oni, they are the enemies of the dragons, with them being involved in a major war at one point long in the past. And I feel like given everything going on with the dragons, I feel like the Oni returning is something that we could potentially see at some point, and we could potentially see another Oni and Dragon war at some point during Dragons Rising. Especially given the existence of the Source Dragons, I feel like it would make sense if there were Source Oni in order to balance everything out. And if the Oni were to return, then I feel like we could potentially see the return of the Omega at some point. I feel like that is a possibility. After this, we have Unagami, and when it comes to Unagami, the main reason why I feel like he could potentially return is because of stuff with Jay. We know that Jay ended up losing his memories, and he was corrupted by the power of Shatterspin during Part 2 of Season 2 of Dragons Rising, and it's a bit unclear what exactly is going to happen with him, but we know that Kai and Nia are going to be looking for Jay, and they're going to try and get Jay back to the way he was. And something that I think would be interesting is if, in an attempt to try and get Jay to remember who he is, we saw the return of Unagami. And the main reason why I think this would be interesting is because of the Quest for the Lost Powers book, where during Jay's story in that book, Jay and Unagami ended up forming a really close bond with each other, with the two of them even considering themselves to be brothers by the end of the book. Meaning that we could potentially see Unagami return, and he could potentially play some kind of role when it comes to Jay remembering who he is. That is just speculation, but I feel like Unagami's return is something that we could potentially see. And finally, that just leaves us with Chief Mamatus, and when it comes to Chief Mamatus, yet again, I feel like his return is something that could happen, mainly because of the set leaks that we've been getting for potential Season 3 sets for Dragons Rising, and according to the leaks, there are multiple sets that have to do with storms. And given that Chief Mamatus and the Keepers have a big connection to storms, given the fact that they were guarding the Storm Amulet, I feel like it's possible that we could maybe see them return if Season 3 of Dragons Rising does have something to do with storms, and the Keepers do have some kind of connection to it. Although I will admit, when it comes to Chief Mamatus, I don't think his chances of returning are as likely in comparison to some of the other villains that I've talked about. Finally, though, we have the villains who I feel will not be returning in Dragons Rising, and in my opinion, there are 7 villains who won't be returning in Dragons Rising, and these are the remaining 7 villains who I haven't talked about yet, with those villains being Samukai, Kozu, Cryptor, Chen, Calamar, Yang, and Harumi. I don't think any of these villains are going to appear in Dragons Rising, and it's for a few reasons. For starters, when it comes to the first 5 villains that I've talked about, they're dead. These are all of the dead villains that we have when it comes to the Ninjago franchise. Well, excluding Moro, but I already talked about him. But either way, I don't think we're going to see these villains return at some point during Dragon's Rising, mainly because, again, they are dead. Now, like I said, we don't really know how the Departed Realm works, meaning it's possible that we could see these villains return, but honestly, I really don't think that's going to happen, because like I said, I feel like if there's any dead Ninjago villain who will return, it's going to be Moro, but that's going to be it. And when it comes to these villains, again, given the fact that they are dead, I don't think their return is very likely. After this, we have Yang, and the big reason why I feel like Yang isn't going to return is because of Air Jitsu. Air Jitsu is a major thing that's associated with Yang, given the fact that he was the creator of Air Jitsu in the first place, and given that the show hasn't done anything with Air Jitsu ever since Season 7, or Season 12 if you count Nia briefly using it at one point. Either way, though, the show hasn't used Air Jitsu in years, and I highly doubt that we're gonna see Air Jitsu make a return at some point during Dragon's Rising. And given that Yang is pretty heavily tied to Air Jitsu, I don't really think he's going to return. The only way I could really see Yang returning is if the show wanted to have some kind of story involving him and Cole. Given that Yang is a Cole villain, meaning it's possible that we could see him return if the show wanted to do some kind of story involving Cole. But either way, I don't think it's going to happen, and I don't really think Yang's going to show up during Dragon's Rising. And finally, that just leaves us with Harumi, and I honestly think that out of every villain that I've discussed in this video, Harumi is the least likely villain to return in Dragon's Rising, mainly because of all the controversy that surrounds her. It is no question that when it comes to Harumi, she is one of, if not the most divisive and controversial Ninjago characters of all time. To the point that Tommy Andreasen, the co-creator of Ninjago, even acknowledged this during an interview that he was on the TTV YouTube channel, with him saying that Harumi is a very polarizing character. And given that the co-creator of the show is acknowledging how polarizing of a character Harumi is, I think that's a pretty big deal. And I feel like because of all the controversy that surrounds Harumi, especially given what happened during the events that crystallized, given Harumi's return and her redemption, as well as the way the show handled stuff with her relationship with Lloyd, and given how many people, myself included, really did not like what Crystallized did with Harumi, I feel like the writers probably don't want a repeat of that to happen, so I don't think that Harumi's return is very likely, mainly because of all the controversy that surrounds Harumi and how divisive of a character she really is. I don't think Harumi's return to the franchise is impossible, but again, I do feel like when it comes to Harumi, she does have the lowest chances of returning out of every villain that I've talked about, mainly just because of how controversial and divisive of a character Harumi is, and how a lot of people have a lot of very different opinions on her. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So, out of all the villains that I've talked about in this video, I feel like there is one villain who will be returning in Dragon's Rising, 5 villains who are likely to return during Dragon's Rising, 11 villains who could return in Dragon's Rising, and 7 villains who I think won't be returning in Dragon's Rising. But that is just my opinion. So tell me down below, what do you guys think? Tell me what are your guys' thoughts on this, and tell me which villains do you think could return in Dragon's Rising. Again, tell me down below, and I hope you guys enjoy. Later, guys. This is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.